Whoops. All right, can we hear me? Okay, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to another, I guess it's only the second Counterculture live podcast show. Today, I'm going to talk about a debate that was done between Savan, Tyler Mid-South, and Tanner Shuck himself. I know that this podcast has been out, or this live debate, whatever it is, has been out for about 2 weeks now. But I just recently got hold of it, and I really wanted to address some things in here because I think it's important for the CrossFit community at large. If people are serious about wanting to grow CrossFit as a modality, as a community, and as a sport, I think that there's a lot of disservice that is done here. So I wanted to take the time to give my take on CrossFit programming, the efficiency of it. Is it proper for the Gen population? Is it the most effective for Gen Pop? And address a lot of things that they said in the podcast. To be fair, the beginning of the podcast is strength training superior than CrossFit to get somebody healthy? That's basically what the premise of the podcast was, what the live was. And they didn't really cover a whole lot of that. So what I'm going to be doing in this is I will address that likely at some point during this podcast or during this live. But I'm going to go through a bunch of points that they actually talked about during the show, because I think a lot of the points are they're worth at least talking about. So real quick, I wanted to address some things. I am not going to be talking about what happened at the CrossFit Games this past weekend in this podcast. I'm going to let some of my thoughts, I have a lot of opinions on it. I'm going to let some of those opinions and thoughts kind of hash themselves out as the weeks go on. As the days go on. I'll probably do a live about it on Thursday or maybe sometime this weekend and put out a full podcast about it. But yeah, just right now, I don't know if it's the right time for me to comment on this stuff. And also I want to say, when I talk about CrossFit, the majority of times I'm looking at it as an outsider in who genuinely wants to see CrossFit win. I can understand that CrossFitters really have an emotional tie to CrossFit itself as a community, not so much as, look, there's something really interesting about CrossFit, and this is a topic for another podcast for sure. And I need to get with somebody who's a professional in CrossFit and then have somebody who's outside of CrossFit along with myself to talk about this, because I believe personally, as somebody who's a fan of CrossFit, the modality, that there's no real separation or definition between what CrossFit is at its core and CrossFit as a business. And I think the two get conflated way too often, and that's really hindering growth of CrossFit, and that's hindering the ability to give it out to the masses. And so that's something that really needs to be addressed. And so I can see now, being in the CrossFit community and doing content there and podcasts with a bunch of CrossFitters, how tight the community is and how passionate they are about CrossFit because of what it has done for their life. However, I think that because of the emotional attachment to CrossFit as a community and a modality, because of that and the attachment to athletes and all these things, I think that it truly hinders people's ability to be objective about what needs to happen to the sport in order for it to grow. And this is clear case made, reason, a huge reason. So look, the reason why I think that this conversation is important, the debate that they had, is because I truly believe that it's conversations like this coming from the CrossFit space that really hinder its growth. Because in the conversation, Taylor Mid-South talks about how, he has anecdote and all these things. He talks about that. And Tanner is coming from a viewpoint that is very backed by science, very backed by the actual data, that the exercise physiology data, the exercise science data. It's very backed. And what happens is this conversation, because Taylor's passionate about CrossFit, as he should be, it's, in my opinion, I want to make it clear, the best modality, bar none, for anyone to get into if they're looking for longevity and health in general. I'll explain that later, and I'll explain also why it's kind of a double-edged sword. However, the conversation that's had is Tanner is speaking about things that are factual, and Taylor is speaking from, and Savon, we're speaking from a side that is from emotional attachment. And it's very clear. And I have a bunch of points written down to explain why this is an emotional attachment thing rather than an intellectual, factual conversation. So some of the things that I want to address are, the conversation starts off with what is better, CrossFit or traditional SNC, strength and conditioning? We'll just say strength training. And this is a really, really hard conversation to have because the fact is, with CrossFit, even the sport of CrossFit and all the skills that are required for CrossFit, the barrier to entry is strength. That is the barrier to entry to do CrossFit whatsoever. Tanner's main concern is you need to be strong enough to perform a given skill, even if it's walking, you need to be strong enough to perform a squat off of a chair. And this is often brought up in the conversation is the 80-year-old that needs to get up off a chair. The barrier to entry for CrossFit as a whole, as a modality for people to do, is strength. Strength is the one thing that is absolutely required in order to move your body. You need to be strong enough in order to move your body. There's no debating that. Now, the thing that I will say is that CrossFit will help you gain strength. It will help the average population, the Gen Pop, gain strength in order to be able to do movements, in order to be able to live life. But the question is whether or not it's the most efficient thing. And the most efficient way to gain strength is not CrossFit at its core, what it's defined. And I think a really big problem with CrossFit as well is that nobody even knows what it is. And no one knows what it is. And CrossFitters don't do a good job at explaining what it is. And when you say it is constantly varied movements over broad times and whatever, you take it's a 2-sentence basically explanation of what the modality is. But that changes often. And what I mean by the fact that it changes is that the people's perception of who are saying the definition, it changes all the time. There's not one person that you can ask that they're going to say the same thing of what constantly varied means. And so one of the questions, right? Because the clip that they were addressing in this was Mark Ripito and Tanner Shuck. Mark Ripito says that CrossFit is not training because it's constantly varied, and because it's constantly varied, you cannot have predictable outcomes. And Tanner doubles down on that, and he says the best thing that you can do is to gain strength for the general population, for anybody that wants to change their body composition or be healthy in general. And so CrossFit as a training modality is not really a training modality. It's an exercise modality. And then that gets into the conversation of what training actually is. And when you're thinking about sport, and when you're thinking about just training, right? When just actually train. What is training? Training is, man, I don't want to say this in a way that is going to be digestible. Training is the accumulation of skills or the accumulation. I guess I'm going to Google this real quick. Define training. Okay. The action of teaching a person or animal a particular skill or type of behavior. But usually when we talk about sport and when we talk about exercise, training has a specific outcome. It has a goal in mind. And with CrossFit, there's no specific training outcome that you're looking for. You're looking to be healthy. And so there's a reason why a 65-year-old woman goes to CrossFit and they don't say, I'm going to go train now. They say, I'm going to go exercise. I'm going to go work out, because that's what it is. There's no specific outcome. The outcome is health. That's what the specific outcome is. So anyway, I'm going to put that one off to the side real quick, and we're going to talk about some stuff. So the first thing that I want to address, and this is going to kind of be all over the place because I was taking notes sporadically throughout the podcast for things to actually address. Will air squats improve a 65-pound 1 rep max? So they get into a discussion about can a guy improve his 1 rep max if he's 80 years old and his max back squat is 65 pounds? Can he improve his 1 rep max by continuing to do a bunch of air squats? And Tanner's argument is that it could do something, but it's not going to be the most efficient way to do it. And I think that this is kind of a nonsensical argument, right? Because obviously if you increase volume over time, it's going to have some sort of even marginal effect on your training, on your 1 rep max, on any stimulus that you may be looking for. However, is it the most effective? Absolutely not. Will it do something? Yes. However, there's going to be diminishing returns over time. You're going to need to be able, and this is one of Tanner's main concerns here, right? Is you need to be able to express force against a load or an external piece of your or a piece of your external environment in order to express strength, to get stronger. You don't just get that from accumulating air squats. You can't. It's not just about muscular endurance to increase your 1 rep max. It's about neurological adaptations. So when you're trying to increase your 1 rep max, you may be somebody who works percentages, right? Who works 72%, and for a 72% back squat, you're doing 3x8. And then the next week, you're going to do 74% for 4x6. The next week, you're going to do 78 for a 5x4, something like that, some sort of linear progression, right? If you're not practicing the skill of 1 rep max, you may not beat your 1 rep max. This is seen time and time again with powerlifters. It is a physiological or a neurological adaptation that you need to make to be able to handle heavier loads over time. You need to practice the skill of doing 1 rep heavy squats in order to improve your 1 rep max for sure, instead of just guessing that maybe that happens, right? And so they say 65-pound 1 rep max versus I'm going to say 95-pound 1 rep max, and the ability to get out of a chair, right? They're saying that basically it's going to be the same. If you have a 95-pound 1 rep max versus a person with a 95-pound 1 rep max versus a person with a 65-pound 1 rep max, absolutely it's going to feel easier for the guy with the 95-pound 1 rep max to get out of the chair than it is the 65-pound 1 rep max guy, because he has the ability to express more force. So he's going to get out of the chair faster, likely, or has the ability to at least get out of the chair faster. As long as everything is equated, there's no injuries, there's no some sort of dysfunctional movements or anything like that. Everything is equated and you're just looking at the numbers. That guy will have an easier time getting out of the chair, and probably a prolonged easier time over the years, so long as he continually gets stronger and expresses force against load over time and is gradually increasing that. Another thing that I really, really wanted to address is what is constantly varied versus random. And this is something that CrossFitters don't even do a good job at explaining either. This is one of their points that they keep bringing up. Tanner would say random. And then they say constantly varied. Consistently, they're saying constantly varied. Well, what does constantly varied mean, and what constitutes constantly varied versus random? Now, I can understand if you're conjugating things, if you're undulating, programming or things like that. But the fact is that most CrossFit gyms are not doing this, right? They're doing things that are random in nature, especially when it comes to Metcons. So what is random versus what is varied? That's kind of what we need to really figure out in order to push this debate forward. It's conversations like these, right? I didn't mention this in the beginning. It's conversations like these that really affect CrossFit being pushed to the masses, because when you have somebody explaining CrossFit in the capacity that Savan and Taylor did, and by the way, I love them. I think that they're great. I think Savan's a G. I think Taylor's really good at what he does. He's obviously good at training, at coaching CrossFit, and also he's a really good CrossFitter. However, the issue is when you have people who are not educated in strength and conditioning talking about strength and conditioning and saying things like this, it makes the experts go downstream, not want to suggest people to do the thing that you're passionate about and the thing that you want pushed out into the masses. That's the biggest issue that I have here. So the lack of strength and conditioning knowledge is absolutely astounding to me, and it needs to be fixed. So anyway, we'll go back to the conversation of what is constantly varied versus random. One thing that Taylor Midself said is that in CrossFit, you're weightlifting 3 times. 3 times a week. You go Monday, Wednesday, Friday. He gives the example of doing an overhead squat or a front squat, an overhead squat, and then like a sandbag squat. And then the next week, you would visit like a Zercher squat, a split squat, and then I don't know, pick your squat. I forget what he said. And that is it. Are you not going to get stronger doing that? Sure, you will get stronger doing that. But how is it measured? How do you measure it? This is the point that comes back to training. How would you measure the outcome? Right? So you would have to do something in the way of and is it the most efficient way to get stronger? So you would have to do something where maybe you tested your 1 rep max at the beginning of a cycle. Which, by the way, now that I've heard this conversation, I wonder what people in CrossFit are talking about when it comes to cycles. Are they talking about macro cycles, mesocycles, microcycles? Are they talking about any sort of actual structured training block? What is it? You would have to do something where you tested a 1 rep max or a max lunge or something like that in the beginning of the block. And then you'd have to do this conjugated or undulated programming that they're talking about. And then you'd revisit in like 8 to 12 weeks, pick your poison. Did you get stronger at the squat? The problem with this is that it's not predictable. Again, you know, if you are practicing the squat and you are following some sort of linear progression, that the most likely outcome is that you are going to get better at the squat. You are either going to break your 1 rep max, your 5 rep max, your 3 rep max, or if you have one of those things that measures force and velocity, you may move the weight faster or easier, your previous 1 rep max. But you're not going to know that that's a predictable outcome if you're constantly varying or randomly choosing movements to do. It's impossible. When you practice a squat, you will get better at the squat. It's just simply how it works. It's the law of specificity. You are doing the thing that you want to get better at. CrossFit in its purest form is not predictable or measurable due to the lack of repeatable workouts. And this is why I think that High Rocks has actually exploded recently. It's very, very similar to CrossFit in the fact that it's functional movements, right? We could go over what functional movement actually means. I don't think that exists, but we could go over what that actually means. But the reason why I personally believe that it's become so popular and why I think it will actually outperform CrossFit in the long term is because, like any other fitness event, triathlons, marathons, 5Ks, you name it, basketball even, right? All of these things have a specific desired outcome with the same modalities tested and the same goal every single time. So because it is that way, you can actually give a proper decision on whether or not you have gotten better at that thing. CrossFit does not have that. So it's not predictable. You cannot write a training program that will for sure make you better at CrossFit. We don't even know what CrossFit is because there's not definable movements in CrossFit. It changes all the time, which, by the way, I think is great. I think that's amazing. It should change all the time because it keeps it exciting and it keeps it, engaging and things of that nature. But the fact is that you will never know if you're actually getting better at CrossFit or if you're getting more efficient at handstand walking, if your capacity on pulling has gotten better, or if your cardiovascular fitness has gotten better. What is the thing that actually isn't bottlenecking you anymore? It's really hard to tell when you're not repeating movements or modalities over time and when the workouts aren't the same. I've had this discussion before. What I think would be the best way for CrossFit to do things in order for you and elites and everyone to know that they've actually gotten better and they're not diminishing is if they had one core workout every games that they have to do, that you have to do. And even then, it'd be very hard to tell if you're actually getting better or if you're just getting more efficient. The two, I don't think, are necessarily the same, right? Are you actually getting more fit or have you become more efficient? How much more have you practiced this workout throughout the year? And did that make you any better? That's where the transfer actually happens, right? So going from that, you guys heard me say transfer. Another thing that they brought up that is really kind of concerning to me, actually concerning, is they bring up the idea of skill transfer to sport. I'm just not sure that, and this is not a dig. This isn't me trying to be an asshole, but I'm not even sure that they know what that means because of the way that they bring it up in the podcast, that there's a skill transfer. At one point, Taylor himself says that the skill transfer of sport, right? Like, who's going to have a faster 40-yard dash? Or who's going to be stronger? The guy with a 3.5 40-yard dash or the guy with like a 4.42 or something like that? I forget what he says. And Tanner Shuck answers, the guy with the 3.5 is probably going to be stronger. And then Tanner goes, right. So you can make the argument that you could just improve your 40-yard dash and then he would be the stronger guy, or he would get stronger because of that. There's skill transfer. Well, that's not what skill transfer to sport even means. That's just not it. That's not what skill transfer in sport means. And that wouldn't be applicable at all. Because the idea is that you get stronger in order to be more resilient, in order to be able to in order to recruit type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers better and make yourself more efficient and stronger so that you can get off the line faster. But then again, we have to talk about, because they said this too, that CrossFit's going to make you a better marathoner, CrossFit's going to make you a better fighter, CrossFit's going to make you a better football, all this stuff. No. And we'll stick to the sprinter example because it's specificity. Again, it's really, really simple, like exercise physiology 101 concept is specificity. So somebody who's a good CrossFitter at your local box, right, is probably not going to be faster than your high school 200 runner. Probably not going to be faster. Like, there may be the exception, but not the rule, right? He may be better than some of the high school runners that are 200, that run the 200, but probably not the majority. Why? Because specificity. They have learned the skill of running. They have learned the skill of sprinting. They have learned the skill of what's it called? Of skipping. They know how to strike. They know how to strike their foot under their hip. They know how to pull through their hamstring. They have the skills in order to be a good sprinter. And so how do they improve that? They get stronger as well. Now, I'll say this. It would work the inverse way. So you see this time and time again with CrossFit instead of the inverse way. Is that somebody who is good at sport or a specialist in a sport, the skill transfer goes to CrossFit from their sport because they've taken time to practice that skill and they've gotten very good. Gymnasts in CrossFit do really well, not because they did CrossFit, because they did gymnastics. That's skill transfer to sport. Skill transfer from CrossFit to other sports is almost not applicable whatsoever. Strength from CrossFit to sport, that's a different story. But skill transfer, no, absolutely not. It's almost not a thing. So again, you see it all the time with gymnasts. You see it with runners, people who specialize with that. You see it with weightlifting. You see it with powerlifting. It transfers to CrossFit, not the other way around where you're trying to go CrossFit outward. CrossFit and then other strength sports, sure, but definitely not actual sports with a ball or, combat sports and things of that nature. And we'll get to the combat sport thing soon. And if this wasn't true, my next question would be, why is CrossFit not adopted by the world's top athletes if it is the end-all be-all answer? And that's because it is not the most efficient way to get strength and to be conditioned for sport. It's not measurable. When you want to increase your VO2 max for sure, there are steps to get there. When you want to get stronger for sure, there are progressions to get there. When you want to be more conditioned in general, there are ways to get there. What CrossFit does really well is they train very well, the people who are training, right? The people who want to compete, they train very well for that sport, constantly varied over different broad time modalities. They train for that sport. So yeah, they're going to be really good at that sport. They're going to be good at varying exercises for that sport. That doesn't mean that it transfers. The best, arguably the best fighter in the world, John Jones, ever, the best fighter ever, didn't train CrossFit. He trained powerlifting. I don't think there's really much else to say. When football players want to get stronger, they take an off season. They're in their off season. They strength train. And then as they get closer to season, they do more agility work. They do more sprinting. They do more conditioning. They do skill acquisition work because that's what they need. They don't need to be doing Metcons year round. And actually, I have run this experiment in my own practice. If you guys don't know, I work with high school athletes who are in top tier clubs in the country that do travel. And I work with also people who go to D2, D1. I help them get scholarships. There's a reason why I don't prescribe them CrossFit and CrossFit Metcons, because we need measurable results. We need to be able to measure, and we need to be able to know, is your squat actually getting better? That doesn't mean that we don't vary things over time, because absolutely we do, but we do it in blocks. We do it in a good periodization fashion. So it will be like 8 to 12 weeks, or I vary it a little bit more actually. 6 to 10 weeks of a back squat on one day, 6 to 10 weeks of some sort of split squat on another day. And then we keep it that way for the long period of time. Now somebody's going to come in here and be like, well, it's not varied enough, so it's not going to be engaging. These guys don't care. These care. They want results, and they want it to be measurable. And their parents don't care. And their parents want it to be measurable. They don't care about varied. They want to be the best. And that's how you become the best. You measure things. Now, there's a point in the argument where they begin to talk about how shitty CrossFit gyms are doing random programming. Sorry. There becomes a time in the conversation where they talk about shitty gyms are doing random stuff instead of constantly varied. And again, I'll defer back to my question of, I still don't know what that means, because they said a whole lot of nothing in that podcast about what that actually means. Now, what I will say is that they say that good CrossFit gyms do, I'm going to assume what he was talking about is they do some sort of like strength cycle. They work on something consistently. Now, what I would want to say about that, and I think this is very important, is that making the exception for gyms or camps that do things good ways is not an example for CrossFit at large, right? So yes, there are going to be camps like Proven or TTT, that's who I'm affiliated with, that do good progressions and do actual training blocks and do, some of their stuff is undulated periodization and things of that nature. But there are going to be people that do things well, but that doesn't speak for the mass, right? And they keep referring to main site, and then they say, don't look at main site anymore because it's not CAP programming or whatever. Unfortunately, you have to, regardless of if it's main site programming or not, or CAP programming. That's where the information of CrossFit comes from. So that's who you will defer your judgment to, is CrossFit, main site, and anybody that's a part of it. It's not going to be the 50 out of, I don't know, thousands of CrossFit gyms that do things the right way. It's not going to be them. It's going to be every other gym and every other camp that speaks for CrossFit and CrossFit HQ themselves. That's where this all comes from. It doesn't come from the exceptions to the rule. And we can all have our opinions on that, on whether or not, CrossFit, like that. Never mind. We can all have our opinions on whether or not CrossFit is good or not, things of that nature. But anyway. So, okay. The next thing is Savan and Taylor Midself both kept coming up with this example of strongmen and powerlifters as examples for health, and that they're obviously not examples for health because they're all fat and they're out of shape and blah, 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 blah. Again, they're missing the mark again, that it's not about strength training. With powerlifting and strongman, are they doing strength training? Yes, but they're also specifying for a specific sport. They are not worried about health outcomes. The same way that CrossFitters are specifying for a sport, they are also not worried about health outcomes or getting injured. that is not the bringing up the examples of strongman and powerlifters in order to make an example for why strength training is worse than CrossFit is it's not even it's a false argument. It's a false dichotomy because, again, training specifically for sport, that would be like saying football players are not a good example for health either. Well, of course not. That's not a good example for health. It's an example of people who are doing a sport. So people like Dave Tate, people like Mitchell Hooper, and all these people that you might look at and think they're out of shape, they're fat, they're not healthy. That's not the goal. The goal is to be the best at their given sport, the same way as it is for CrossFitters. And one looks healthier than the other. Sure, one may be healthier than the other. That's debatable. But again, the goal is specificity. It's not to be healthy. Powerlifters are not trying to be healthy. I was a powerlifter for years. I did strongman for years. My goal wasn't to be healthy. It was to be as strong as humanly possible. So I gained a bunch of weight. Weight moves weight. That's how you get better at those sports. Man, I'm going to tell you what, this really fired me up. This podcast, this argument. So now something else, something that they brought up that was, I keep saying something else. I'm just going over my notes and giving you guys the points that I thought were the most important from this conversation. Does CrossFit versus traditional strength and conditioning give you a higher probability for injury? This is something that is, I think, grossly overestimated for CrossFit. That CrossFit gets you injured more often. Actually, I'm pretty sure there was a meta-analysis that came out that compared CrossFit versus bodybuilding and powerlifting, and the outcomes for injury were very negligible. Like they were like this close. So, if it's 0.01% or whatever, is it really, a valuable piece of information? Not really. So I don't think that the probability for injury is higher just because you do CrossFit. What I will say is that Savan brought up the example of if you just do strength training, and you don't do CrossFit and you're doing some sort of sport like jiu-jitsu where you stay in a full range of motion, you're going to get snapped up easier if you're just focusing on strength training rather than CrossFit. Again, let's explain it. Like, why would that be true? In my opinion, right? And I actually have this, this next example I'm going to lead into my next example of a question or of a statement that they made. This doesn't make sense for the same reason that Tanner Shuck said, is that the stronger you are, the more resilient to injury you are, the more resilient you are to things in your external environment actually hurting you, the more resilient to pain you are. There's so many reasons why that wouldn't be true and can't be true, because you're able to handle more load. You're able to handle more force at any given time. I mean, somebody cranking on your elbow is going to hurt you regardless of the modality of exercise that you do. It's just what's going to be more resilient, a stronger muscle or a less strong muscle? A stronger muscle, because you also have the benefit of like tendon strength and joint and ligament health along with that. As long as you're healthy in general. Weightlifting at its core, for the most part, if you're training hard often, you're going to have aches and pains and you're going to get hurt at some point. It's not a matter of if, it's when. So it's not really what modality do you choose. It's just how hard are you pushing it, how often, and how old are you? What are you doing to recover? All these different things that kind of compound into, is something else going to hurt you? It doesn't really have to do with the modality. It's more so all the other factors that go into play. What's your training volume? What's the intensity like? Again, how much are you eating? What, are you nutrient deficient? Like are you well hydrated? There's so many different things. It's not really the modality. And also they bring up something about mobility. There's a difference between strength training and hypertrophy, right? Strength training is the neurological adaptation that your body makes in order to express force. Hypertrophy doesn't necessarily mean that you have to bench 400 pounds. Hypertrophy is the physiological adaptation to create new tissue in order for your muscles to get bigger. And so if you're a muscle-bound Ronnie Coleman guy, is your mobility going to suffer? It may, But there's guys like Kai Green out there. There's so many examples of like super athletic, very heavy 300 plus pound bodybuilders that don't lose mobility. A lot of those guys are stiff and immobile because they're dealing with injury rather than a lack of mobilization, or they don't work on mobilization at all. CrossFit is not going to give you better mobilization just because it's CrossFit, and strength training is also not going to immobilize you just for the sake of being strength training. And actually, a meta-analysis came out, or a study, there's a study out there. Go on Menno Henselman's page and you'll find it. He did a breakdown of the study that mobilization training compared to moving through a full range of movement with, or full range of motion with weight under load, had the same outcomes. Actually, the weightlifting had better outcomes for mobilization. So both camps are working through a full range of motion, the strength training and CrossFit. They're both. The thing that I would say though, is that the CrossFit camp has a higher chance of injury if you're doing Olympic weightlifting because it's more dynamic. And so the confusion between, we just went over that. So does CrossFit versus strength and conditioning give you a higher probability of injury? I would say no to both of them. What I will say is this. Savan brings up the example of a world-class fighter would be better from doing CrossFit than traditional strength and conditioning because the transfer of skill. Again, it's going to be more transferable to a sport. In what WOD, right? In what WOD does a fighter have to do a dumbbell snatch? Or wait, no. In what UFC fight or boxing arena or jiu-jitsu have you seen a UFC fighter have to do a dumbbell snatch? When have we ever seen that? And in what WOD are people throwing left hooks, a heavy right, and a roundhouse kick or a spinning back fist? It's not there. It's not applicable. It's not going to benefit sport. The conditioning from CrossFit, sure. I kickbox. The shoulder conditioning from CrossFit, the muscle endurance, which doesn't have to be done because of, or, due to CrossFit, I could have approached it in another way, has for sure helped my stamina in my shoulders to be able to hold my hands up high and be able to strike longer and do longer 7 3-minute rounds with 1 minute rest. Absolutely. But that is a compounding effect of conditioning, not just CrossFit. So would the world-class fighter be better from CrossFit rather than strength and conditioning? Probably not. And to be honest with you, I would think that the fighter would have a higher probability of injury training CrossFit, especially if he's deep in a fighting camp from training CrossFit at high intensities, rather than just doing strength training and traditional conditioning, because it's much more variable, which means there's less chance of adaptation, which means that there's a higher chance for injury because there's lack of skill acquisition, and then there's more soreness from the lack of adaptation. And more soreness is going to affect the ability to perfect any skill acquisition that they need to be having. So if they're more sore, they're not going to be able to throw a punch the same way. If they're more sore, they won't be able to throw a roundhouse kick the same way. If they're more sore, the conditioning that they have to do, like bag work for 3 minutes on time, because that's way more applicable to the sport, is going to suffer. Could CrossFit in their offseason help keep them, in shape? Yeah, absolutely. But it's not applicable to the sport whatsoever because it's a different type of fitness. And a fighter better be fighting if they want to get better at fighting, not doing CrossFit. This is one of the last things that I really want to go over in this live, and that is I can barely even read my own handwriting. That's not good. Staying away from metabolic disease versus sport. staying away from metabolic disease versus sport. And then the example of strongman and powerlifters. Yeah. So one of the points here was that powerlifters, again, and strongmen are less healthy than CrossFitters. And I'm not so sure that this is true, or that you can say that this is true. It is true to say that having an adequate or lesser amount of adipose tissue on your frame and having a higher amount of lean tissue is better for health outcomes in general. That may be true. However, there's a lot of things that they're missing the mark with on this too. If we're talking about professional athletes, right? Because we have long gotten away from the general population in their video. It happened almost immediately. When it comes to strongmen and powerlifters and the health outcomes with them versus the professional CrossFitters, I'm not very convinced that they're any healthier or less healthy than a professional CrossFitter is. Athleticism, sure, depends on what CrossFit defines athleticism as, I guess, and depends on what the actual outcome goal is. But what about Matt Frazier saying that he was pre-diabetic because of all the sugar that he had to eat? What about triathletes? This has become pretty common knowledge now. What about the triathletes that are becoming pre-diabetic or actually becoming diabetic due to nutrition that they had to do during their camps, during their preps? You know, what about that? Is it true that CrossFit is better for you in that way, in terms of that? I'm not so sure. I'm definitely not sure about that. I don't think that that's a good argument. In fact, I think it's a straw man argument. It's a false argument. It's not true. It's not something that can be backed up by data. And, you know, it's interesting because a lot of times, you know, CrossFitters will say things like, and I agree with this, by the way, that data and science is falsified and it's bought out by pharmaceutical companies and all these different, you know, things. And I agree with it 100%. However, there's one point in the argument where Tanner Midself says something about this is scientific, about somebody like basically getting an erection, and how it comes from cardiovascular fitness rather than anaerobic fitness, right? Than weightlifting or whatever. And rather than weightlifting, right? And that cardiovascular fitness is going to be the thing that actually helps them out more. He brings up that argument. Anaerobic fitness, weightlifting, has definitely been shown to have cardiovascular benefit. 1000% has. And so it's interesting though, because Taylor says that this is science, you can't argue with it. Okay, everything that Tanner has said in that podcast, in that live, has been verified by the literature. There is no literature on CrossFit, like close to no literature on CrossFit. And I know that the CrossFit, you know, the CrossFit lovey-dovey lover boys are going to say that's because of the NSCA and all this stuff. If I was the NSCA, and no offense to the people that had this conversation, if I was the NSCA and I heard the conversation that was just had, I wouldn't want to study it either. Because it's clear that there's not a lot of strength and conditioning knowledge in the space, like traditional strength and conditioning. Now, some people are going to say, but the exercise physiology world and exercise science world is bought out too. And my argument would be like, show the proof. Show the money. Exercise, like figuring out what's the proper way to periodize programs and figuring out what the proper way to actually get conditioned is, and, you know, different training blocks and modalities, I don't think is going to be bought out. Right. So, yeah, dude, I don't think that there's any way to even combat that by saying that it's bought out by big NSCA or whatever. And by the way, I'm very with most of you guys on that, you know, a lot of science and literature is bought by big pharmaceutical companies or big food and things of that nature. I'm definitely with you. When it comes to exercise, I think it'd be very hard. Nobody's going to benefit off of telling you that an undulated periodization program is more effective for you than a constantly varied program. Who's going to benefit from that besides people like me, who I don't get paid by any major corporation to have that opinion? So I think I've gone over everything that was on my notes. Skill transfer in sport, did that. CrossFit in its purest form is not predictable or measurable. Predictability of outcomes determines what is best for sport. That's true. Examples of individual affiliates. Yup. World-class fighter. Yup. Yeah. So now I really want to make it clear that I do believe that in order to just be healthy, CrossFit is the superior methodology for most people. However, I think that it has diminishing returns. And so one of the major points of contention that Savan and Taylor bring up is, how did CrossFit get so popular? And Tanner says that it's marketing. And then they come back and they say that it's become popular because it works, because it produces results. And 1000%, I will agree with them. But I wonder if they know why it produces results and why it produces results so quickly. As somebody who's from the outside that came in, I said all the things like CrossFit's gay, CrossFit's stupid. Why they do the cheater pull-ups, all these different things. Now, the reason why I think CrossFit seems to be so effective, this is my personal opinion. Let's take a newbie, for example, right? A newbie is going to get a stimulus and see adaptations and, gain results no matter which protocol that they actually do. It just is what it is. There's a bunch of literature on that. There's a bunch of, research on that. The reason why I think CrossFit works so effectively, though, is because it teaches people how to work out intensely fast and do it often. And when you're going from somebody which can also be a bad thing, it can be a double-edged sword. When you're going from somebody who is basically sedentary and unhealthy and has metabolic disease or doesn't have metabolic disease whatsoever, and you're just new to training in general, if you jump into something like CrossFit, you're going to see results very quickly and you're going to love it. And the good thing that CrossFit does is that it keeps exercise engaging. And I think that that's why it works mostly. Intensity and then the engagement. However, the double-edged sword is that it requires a lot of skill acquisition. So people have to acquire certain skills in order to be able to do certain workouts. And because you have to acquire so many skills to do so many workouts to make it interesting and people love it and it's fun, that requires a lot of training volume. And that requires a lot of dynamic movement. And I know the argument here is it can be scaled for anyone, blah, 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 blah. Let's be real. A lot of people don't want to scale, especially in their 20s, early, whatever. We'll talk about older people in a second. But when it's such high dynamic movements, the probability, this doesn't matter if it's CrossFit, weightlifting, any sport, even doing agility workouts on a field for soccer or whatever, when the movements are very dynamic, and if you don't have a really good coach, your probability for injuries skyrocketed through the roof. It's not just CrossFit. It's also if you get somebody take my training, for example. I'll put people in blocks, right? And it's we'll do in their off season, we're doing strength, getting stronger, becoming more resilient. We're keeping some conditioning in there because we need to be conditioned, which by the way is Tanner's whole point about why strength training is best for health, because you can also strength train at the same time as doing conditioning work to maintain a level of fitness, to maintain your ability to be healthy. So anyway, when we're moving forward, in our off season, we're doing strength training because we need that. We need to be resilient. We need to make sure that everything is functional, everything is in place. And then we also do a maintenance level of conditioning, 10 minutes a day, different intensities, things of that nature. And then as we get closer to season, you bring in more things that are more dynamic and so that people don't get hurt. Great example. I was training. No, I wasn't training. Well, I was training. I typically would train this whole high school female lacrosse team. And there was 2 girls that I didn't train. And I'm not saying that this is me, it's because they didn't work with me or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just giving a good example. I typically train them during their off season. As we get closer to season, we do more conditioning. We pull back on the strength a little bit, do maintenance strength, maybe some more hypertrophy style stuff. And then we do conditioning and we do things that are more dynamic in nature that actually require you to be agile and actually require you to be able to express force off the ground and be able to, get from point A to point V very fast, like, normal things that athletes need to do, right? But you start out slow. So you start out plyometrics, you start out dynamic movement, you start out pushing laterally from one cone to another. And then after you make the progression, you move into doing things at high speeds and very dynamic. Now, the two girls that didn't train with me, actually one of the girls that didn't train with me, she didn't do that. She did not progress into agility at high velocities. So what happened? She was sprinting. She needed to do a change of direction very quickly, 90-degree change of direction, flipped her hips. Her body is still moving linearly. When she wants to move, sideways, blows out her entire knee. Why is that applicable, and why is that a demonstration for CrossFit? Because when you don't train something, you don't ease into a modality of training. And when you have to do high dynamic movements at a high velocity, at a high pace, there is always a chance of injury. There is always a probability of injury. That's why that's applicable to CrossFit. That's why it's applicable to every single exercise modality that's out there. Plain and simple. There's a high chance of getting injured. That's just an issue, I guess. I kind of lost where I was at, to be completely real. The last thing that last thing I want to say, but one of the big issues too that I take with the argument that they had was towards the end. And I'm going to be totally honest about this, like completely honest. Look, I want CrossFit to win. Oh, this is where I was going, because I do think it's the best thing for the Gen Pop in order to stay healthy and stuff. But it needs to be done right? And there's 60-year-old women, you can scale workouts and stuff like that for them, absolutely. And I think that it's really good because, even as you get older, you need to learn how to work out at high intensities and things of that nature. I want it to win. I really do. But I want it to win the right way, right? Because I do think that making accessible to the population at large is going to be a good thing. But I just don't think that it's going to get there because of so many issues that it has. And we can talk about CrossFit HQ. We can talk about CrossFit as a community. We can talk about CrossFit coaches, which is something that I want to address right now. One of the points in the podcast as well that they talk about is that that a CrossFit trainer is going to be a better option than anyone else because of whatever reason it was, right? The exposure to people and things of that nature. I want to be very clear. I don't think because you have a master's degree in physiology or biomechanics or any of that things that's going to make you a great coach. I don't think that you having a NASM certification or a CSCS or an NSCA CPT or ACE CPT or specialization courses or anything like that is going to make you a good coach. But what I will say is that it will give you the ability based on education to be a better coach. And I'm not saying that you need to go through a certification process in order to acquire this knowledge. But if you have the knowledge, you're probably better off. And there are some things that aren't learned, which you need, or that are not taught, which you need to learn in the field, which is like how to interact with people, how to interact with a client, how to negate, problems, and how to overcome, mental health or like psychological issues when it comes to training, and, how to address eating disorders. Like there's so many different things that you need to learn in the field rather than from the book. But what I will say is that if you have an understanding of physiology, if you have an understanding of biology, if you have an understanding of exercise science, even 101, if you have an understanding of exercise phys and biomechanics and all these things, you will have a better shot at being a knowledgeable coach than taking your L1. The L1, I don't agree with Taylor's position here at all. As much as I want to see CrossFit win, the barrier to entry to becoming a CrossFit coach a CrossFit affiliate coach is so much lower than it is for any other certification for any other type of gym. It's laughable. I took the L1 and I got nothing from it. I'm just being transparent, open, and honest. I took the L1. I got nothing from it. I learned nothing. I think that CrossFit and the way they set things up is meant for people who are really into CrossFit and love CrossFit and are bought into the cult and the ideology, that they're so bought in that anything they produce is better than anything else. And this is where you need to be objective, right? CrossFit, the L1, is the worst course I've ever taken. And I have taken a lot of certification courses. It's the worst. It didn't teach me anything. Basically, what it teaches you is how to command a room. But there's nothing on biomechanics. There's nothing on movement patterns for the most part. A wall ball, a wall ball clean, something like that, medicine ball clean. But there's no actual mechanics. Like, why does it work like this? It doesn't tell you physiological adaptations, blood pressure modulation, or heart rate variability, heart rate variances, and things of that nature. It tells you nothing. I don't know what the L2 does, so I can't speak to that. But I will tell you the barrier to entry to becoming a CrossFit affiliate coach is that low, that you don't need to actually know how to move. You don't need to actually know what ATP is. You don't actually need to know what sodium does in the muscle. With almost every other accredited certification, you need to know these things. You need to know these things. And so if you have that knowledge, you have a better shot at being a more knowledgeable, better coach, as long as you're willing to put in the hours to understand how to actually work with people on a psychological, emotional, and physical level, spiritual even maybe, financial. You have a much better shot if you're willing to put in all the rest of the work in the field than you will with the L1. I don't know how to say it any nicer than that. I have in my entirety of my career, I think I've accumulated somewhere around the ballpark of between 5 to 10 certifications, and then specializations, taking the courses for, and the L1 was the worst one. It was the worst one. It was not even close. The yoga 200-hour certification, that course was way better because they force you to actually look at anatomy books and yoga anatomy, right? Not that it changes really, but they dude, it's 200 hours of education. So that's my thought on the debate. I think that traditional strength and conditioning for the person who is trying to be a professional athlete is for sure, even for the CrossFit athlete, it is the more beneficial route to go. CrossFit is not. You're going to have to practice CrossFit to get better at CrossFit, but if you want to get stronger for CrossFit, you have to strength train. You have to. There's a reason why, the professionals don't just do kipping pull-ups all the time, but they do weighted pull-ups, strict pull-ups, all these things because they need to gain strength. For your average person, for your general population person, the barrier to entry to doing CrossFit is to gain strength. I think that pretty much takes care of the whole argument right there. That's the barrier to entry. So there's another point. I keep saying this. There's another point where Taylor Midself says something about what would be your recommendation to people? And Tanner answers, but then Taylor says, I would say that you need to lose weight and work out, basically. And it's like, you can do that either way. There's a million ways to skin a cat, right? The most predictable outcome, the most predictable way is not CrossFit. It's going to be a linear periodized program, which a lot of CrossFitters do now is linearly periodized programs, or they do some sort of undulated program, but they always revisit the actual exercise that you're trying to get better at or the skill. And then to be in some sort of caloric deficit, but that's measured. It's actually predictable based on the amount of calories that you're taking in versus what you exert per day. It's measurable. It's a predictable outcome. So yeah, that would be the thing that I would choose to if it came down to making somebody have to lose 100 pounds in 6 months. Yeah. So anyway, I hope you guys did enjoy this live. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I did it alone. Sorry if it was scrambled. I had a lot of ideas that I was trying to get out. I wrote these notes in my iPad as I was listening to this thing, but I don't know, I must have rewinded the video 1,000 times to make sure that I was hitting certain points that I wanted to. So the points that I hit, they didn't exactly go together, but yeah. So look, again, want to make it clear. Last thing I'm going to say, I want to make it clear that I truly enjoy CrossFit. I do CrossFit. It's my preferred training modality now. I do compete. I plan on continuing to compete. I enjoy doing it. I think it's great. I think the reason why it works so well and why it is superior is because it gets people in the gym and keeps them engaged. And the best workout program is going to be the one that you can stick to. It does a really good job at keeping people engaged. It does a really good job at showing people what it means to train intensely. But if we're talking about what is the crux of health and wellness at the end of the day, is it CrossFit or strength training? It's going to be strength training. You need to add tissue to your body. It is the organ of longevity. There's a lot of science on, based on that. And you can do that doing CrossFit. And again, strength is the barrier of entry to CrossFit. And then you build muscle, and there's going to be diminishing returns on doing CrossFit. There's going to be diminishing returns on building muscle. You're not going to continuously build muscle. You're not going to continuously get fitter from doing CrossFit. You have to progress it somehow. And so when you're doing strength training, you can also add in conditioning, and that's probably the perfect mix for people. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this. I hope you did enjoy. If you did, hit that like button, subscribe if you are new, and I will talk to you in the next one. Peace out. Goodbye.